Do what thou swill be the whole piece of law.
It's one computer god challenge after another. Just when I think I'm done, they pull me right back in. I was searching through my compiled information in this lost and abandoned room when I looked under the table and I found 2 more. So guess I'll have to postpone the release a little bit. I want to try and make it the most complete it will ever be. But this one's a bit shorter than normal. So if you're new around here, I'll give you a short little preamble before we go into the entire thing and then talk about the wider political context, because Francis E. Deck is a very political writer, but you have to translate what he says. Not in the sense of the concepts are hard to understand, he just encodes it in his own language. But who is Francis E. Deck? Well, Francis E. Deck is a crazy former lawyer at this point in time from the New York State Bar in Nassau County. He had a lot of complaints with the county and had some beef with the Allstate Insurance Company, and he had a lot to say on the politics of Nassau County. Now, why does anyone care about this guy? Well, he's probably one of the first examples of what people would call a lolcow, but that word kind of rubs me the wrong way and I don't like it. I, as a disinterested archivist, would describe him more as someone who is infinitely interesting. A crystal with infinite faces that refracts light in an infinite amount of different ways. But I learned something today that is a little discomforting, that echoes something that I said in the past, and it may or may not be anything. So I encourage you, we're going to be learning about the local politics of Nassau County today. So if that sounds interesting, please stick around. I know this one is for people who've been paying attention, so if you want to catch up on the context, there's a big playlist of old videos, and maybe subscribe on the way. I can't control you though, as much as I'd like to try, so get ready for the low Louis Lefkowitz rant. 2. Black Mafia gangster Frank Gulata, chief gangster judge, the apoetic Sicilian black man. July 7th, 1987. The felon gangster bribe extortionist Low Louis Lefkowitz, Attorney General, District Attorney Dennis Dillon, and the staff of first-degree felony sodomy and Gomorrah peddling substance addict parties. Many months ago, I wrote you repeatedly, parentheses, typewritten, in detail of felonies committed by Joseph I. Deck, the substance addict, sodomist, and Gomorrahist villain, the murderer of Stacia Verona Brownwell, parentheses, all facts known to you, gangster Sicilian, black man, Frank Gulata, Joseph I. Deck, the hangman rope gangster, the secret assassin agent brother, when you, black mafia Frank Gulata, were district attorney of Nassau County, acid Joseph I. Deck made possible for you, through your lowly felon gangster staff, to constantly burglarize and gangsterize my law office, to your communist gangster computer god, all made possible solely with all of the deadly gangster Frankenstein controls, and your communist gangster computer god rewarded you with your present judgeship, and also rewarded Joseph I. Deck as your assistant deputy court clerk. You hangman rope gangster, untouchable as a gangster judge, moronic, degenerative, Sicilian, black man, Frank Gulata, what have you done with all of my said felony complaints? I demand a reply. Francis E. Deck, Esquire. Seems pretty spiteful, huh? This letter has a lot of context to it, and since this is one of the only dated, if not the only dated rant that we possess, we can actually put into context when this happened. Now, why is this date important? 1987. Well, 1987 would have been the district attorneyship, which is really the only thing that he cares about, of Robert Adams. Now, Robert Adams is a Democrat. He would go on to serve from 1979 to 1993 and was generally considered to be a consumer advocate. He liked to tackle things like pollution, fraud, and redlining of various minority communities. He was honored and generally considered to be not very offensive as an attorney general. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you're an American, we all know that the political divide in this country is pretty bad, but it's always kind of been there. And Francis E. Deck is, from his previous rants, I'd clock him as your bog standard Republican. Now, this may strike something within you when I say that Louis Lefkowitz, the person that he slanders in this letter, was also a Republican. So what's the problem? Well, Louis Lefkowitz, despite being one of New York State's longest reigning attorney generals, being 8 days shy of 22 years in office, is First of all, Jewish. Francis E. Deck, being anti-Semitic, does not like this. He also attended one of the most prominent law schools in New York City, being Fordham. Now, he generally has problems with people who are successful attorneys, because people who are successful didn't get their law license revoked like he did. Quite unjustly, if you asked him yourself, although you can't anymore. But why did he have problems with Lefkowitz if Lefkowitz shared his politics? Well, namely that he was Jewish. But second of all, putting aside any inherent characteristics, he was what's considered a liberal Republican. Now, what are liberal Republicans? Liberal Republicans are people who share the Republican economic platform, but usually have some left-leaning ideals. Someone who's also mentioned in this letter that we're going to get to later, Dennis Dillon, was also a liberal Republican. But let's not focus too much on Dennis Dillon right now. Louis Lefkowitz was a close associate of Nelson Rockefeller. Now, if you don't know who Nelson Rockefeller is, he was the vice president under Gerald Ford. So if you didn't know who Gerald Ford is, you have no idea who Nelson Rockefeller is, and I had no idea who Nelson Rockefeller was before I looked him up. Gerald Ford is someone who Francis E. Deck takes a lot of issues with, despite him being one of the most milquetoast, not make anyone angry presidents of all time. Nelson Rockefeller was a stated Republican, and he is a member of the Rockefeller family. Now, Francis E. Deck, kind of, if you can get a beat on who he is, if you haven't had the prior context, does not like the Rockefellers. The Rockefellers are a large part of the computer god conspiracy that he's building, which means that Louis Lefkowitz is a computer god pawn installed by Nelson Rockefeller of the Rockefeller family, taking orders from check launderer, yokel felon Gerald Ford through Nelson Rockefeller. The parroting puppet scum on top go deep, huh? But what makes these liberal Republicans or Rockefeller Republicans different? They were distinct in the fact that they wanted the Republican, generally free trade, pseudo-protectionist economics, but they completely disavowed laissez-faire, hands-off economic policies. No Ayn Rand objectivism here. They were a big fan of good, honest people having a thing to fall back on, a safety net, and they generally thought that FDR's programs were good. Now, if you know Francis E. Deck, FDR was one of the most devastating torpedoes in the hull of the American nation, if not the death blow that the computer god dealt to the entire country. The other thing that distinguished liberal Republicans is they wanted to have ways for people to succeed. They wanted to fund programs that got people into the places that they wanted to be. Another thing that might surprise you is liberal Republicans, or Rockefeller Republicans, also were strong advocates for labor unions, especially in the trades. However, as Thatcher and Reagan were beginning to crack down on labor unions, the more liberal element of the Rockefeller Republicans were absorbed into the typical Democratic platform. Now, Francis E. Deck, being, from what I can tell, an anti-Semitic, racist man living in Nassau County, probably didn't like any of these things, mainly because a lot of these liberal Republicans, namely Nelson Rockefeller and Dennis Dillon, were both supporters of the Civil Rights Act, which he doesn't explicitly ever say it, but I am going to go out on a limb and say that Francis E. Deck was not the biggest fan of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I know that might be a stretch, but I'm confident in saying it. Now, there was also someone else that I think is quite impossible to give you a good picture of without you having watched the rest of the context, and that is Frank Gullotta. Now, Frank Gullotta is the Attorney General for Nassau County, and, well, he started out his career as the District Attorney of Nassau County, and then ended as a Supreme Court judge for New York State. How he got those positions is, if you were a reasonable person would say, is a normal career advancement and quite respectable in his position. If you were Francis, you'd say he was given it by the computer god for all of the gangster-esque practices and extortion practiced upon him throughout Frank Gullotta's district attorneyship. Now, Frank Gullotta is known for really one thing outside of Francis E. Deck, and that is his treatment of a murder trial in which he boiled down a large jury pool to a small, focused jury pool, which he took special pride in crafting himself. Some may say it's rigging, some may say that it is just rigorous attorneyship. Francis E. Deck would say it's rigged. He also talks about a man named Joseph I. Deck. Now, Joseph I. Deck is quite the enigma on his own, and I don't want to dispel too much of that enigma before I get to the massive collation of all of these recordings that I've kept in this backpack that I've lugged through this computer god facility. But when I do, I will cover Joseph Idek in more detail, because Francis has nothing but slander for him, and we don't really get a third-party perspective on what he is. Joseph Idek seemed to work in the governmental apparatus, and was eventually promoted to assistant deputy court clerk. Now, we don't know what he was before this, and we'll never know, because he is currently in the ground right now, so I can't ask him. However, Francis insists that Frank Gulata gave him kickbacks for helping him deal with his brother, whether that be legitimate or not. Francis would contribute this to computer god meddling, but personally, I think it's just a horrible coincidence. He also levels a murder charge at Joseph, which I cannot find a single thing on at the moment. If you know anything about this or where I could start, please let me know. Leave a comment. It would be invaluable to find out if this were actually true. He also doesn't treat his brother too well verbally, but his brother treats him even less well physically. And it seems that the point of this letter is Francis at this point has submitted legal action or complaints or tips to the district attorney's office of New York State and demands a reply from the structure. But that does not make sense with the date that he's given, as Frank Gulata at this time would be a Supreme Court judge and would in fact have no power to investigate these whatsoever. He would have to kick it to Robert Adams. But this is just one of those small things that we have. It's another one of those small Francis little lights, glimmers in the darkness of what was going through his head, I think 2 years before he would suffer his episode, which makes me want to judge more of his writings in a different light when they might have occurred chronologically. But this is just one that's a product of its time. I just remembered I didn't give you anything about Dennis Dillon. So, Dennis Dillon is the district attorney of Nassau County after Frank Gulata abandoned the position. He served for 30 years from 1975 to 2005, and he basically received unanimous support across the board until he split due to conflicts over abortion rights, because he's a Catholic and he was a member of the New York State Right to Life Party. I'll let you do the rest of the math. But why wouldn't Francis Idek like this guy? Well, first of all, District Attorney of Nassau County, not Frank Gulata, but now he's the figurehead that he can take shots at, so he will. He's also a Catholic. If you don't know why Francis Idek hates Catholics, you can watch this video about the high-tech Crusader priests from the future who used the black robes of Catholic priests to disguise themselves. Yes, that's real in this man's head, and I encourage you to go watch it if that insanity intrigues you. But anyway, I don't really know if there's much more I can say, so I won't. I'll leave it for some aggregator drone or myself when I get back. I know I don't do it enough, but I would like to extend a personal thank you for watching. These projects vary in quality, mainly how I've been doing that week, and I'm finding it harder to find dedicated time, but I'll fall into a groove. I'll get it. I want to make high effort videos, probably somewhere around 10 to 20 minutes, about every week or so. So sometimes forgive me if they're a little shorter or longer, depending on how my flashes of inspiration go. I got a little down this week, so this one's going to be a little shorter, but hopefully I'll bounce back next week. I'd like to thank you for watching. Please leave a like, leave a comment, leave a subscribe. For your only hope for a future, that's me, the one continuation of a dead man screaming into the void. Support your local artist. I don't use any generative tools or any shortcuts. I do this all myself, and I credit those who helped me along the way. So thank you deeply, and sift through this computer god nightmare.